How to take down the $500,000 grand prize in the FFPC Playoff Challenge. That's what we're talking about today in Stealing Bananas at Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his fantastic work over at RotoViz. Shawn wrote a primer and some thoughts about the Underdog playoff contest, has a write-up for the FFPC contest. Pretty much almost done as well, you were telling me, and that will probably post by the time that anyone is hearing this. So be sure to go check those things out at RotoViz. Those write-ups, those look fantastic. They'll give you a lot of in-depth thoughts. We love to play this contest, the FFPC one. We've talked about it over the last couple of years, Shawn. It's a really fun contest for people who don't know all of these specifics. You set one lineup at the beginning, and that is your lineup for the whole contest. We can only pick a maximum of one player from each team. You have to fill a lineup of 12 slots, a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receiver, a tight end, which it is tight end premium, and then 4 flexes as well. And so there's a lot of ways you can play those flexes. You can play multiple tight ends in the tight end premium format. You can play up to 6 running backs or up to 6 wide receivers. You play a kicker, you play a defense, and then there are 2 teams of the 14 that you will not select a player from. That's how you fill out a lineup. That's the simplicity of the contest. Then there is the complexity of the contest, all of the strategy and the things that go with it. And there are a lot of ways to think through how you want to play it. Some of the really simple strategy stuff include that you want probably your quarterback to be going deep into the contest. The ways that quarterbacks can score fantasy points obviously matter. You want the teams that you're playing the kicker or the defense or not playing any players from, you want them to typically be teams that are one and done in the playoffs and not playing multiple games. They're more likely to not compile a lot of points. So there are some layers like that. One final little wrinkle, the Super Bowl is double points. You get 2 times the player's score. So there's a maximum of essentially like 5 scores for if a team from Wildcard Weekend plays 4 games and it gets the double points on the Super Bowl, they're almost like getting 5 game scores. And then you will have several players in your lineup that only have 1 game score. They only play 1 game in the playoffs because not everyone wins a game in the playoffs, right? That's the way the playoffs work. So that's sort of the brief rundown, Shawn. That's the fun of the contest. Before we really dive into the complexity of it, though, we haven't recorded something in a few weeks. We did some stuff over the last couple of weeks. You did some stuff with family. I did some traveling, some Husky football. Bummer to see them lose in the national championship, but got some awesome memories getting to travel to their semifinal and final games in New Orleans and Houston. Shawn, how are you doing? How's it been over those last couple of weeks?
Good. It's been so much fun to get to share some Christmas with family. It's been a lot of fun to hear from so many listeners and readers in the aftermath of the season. Ben, you and I just, bittersweet, but basically sweet, to where Sunday morning we were in 3rd place in the main event. Now, that may have, mildly overstated where we were, since we'd obviously gotten some good scoring in the games that took place before Sunday. But with a good Sunday, we had a shot. We did not have that. We know that some people who listen and consume the content in different ways had fantastic Sundays. Congratulations to them. That's so cool. I mean, you win the $1 million. That's a life-changing event there. You, Ben, had 2 teams that finished in the top 30. I was excited to have my team with Colin Kelly, my RotoViz OT co-host, make a charge in the final week and get up to 125. So it was a lot of fun to have a couple teams cash in that event. And now, I mean, it's so much fun to be looking forward to these playoff contests. I've spent a lot of time with the RotoViz tools this week. Obviously, a lot of time chatting with other people who are interested in these events. And the thing I've really been pointing to all week is a chance to discuss this with you. So I couldn't be more fired up for this. I'm excited to get your thoughts. We did chat for a while before the show, so I know some of the things that are coming. And, as is often the case, it was pretty cool to know that we are in sync on a few of these. So, Ben, we're going to work through some of the games. We're going to work through some of the teams, some of the strategy elements. You really set the stage perfectly. But let me ask you if the next thing that we're kind of thinking, because 6 teams are going to be eliminated this week, right? And you mentioned what we want to have happen with 4 of them. Would you say it's the case that with the other 2 teams that are eliminated, we would prefer for them to be teams where we have taken a lower rostered player who goes off and then cannot be jumped by his higher rostered teammate the following week because it's just 1 and out. They're already out. Those points are locked in. You can't lose that advantage. That's one of the things that we really focused on in the playoff 2 contest last year that we had a lot of fun with. Obviously, the one that happens next week, Ben, we were a Richie James non-catch away from a huge result in that one. I mean, the $500,000 feels much closer than it actually is in reality. That's how you want to feel going into these contests.
Yeah, the million probably was as well. You mentioned we were in third through Saturday. I forgot we hadn't really even had a chance to recap that stuff for our listeners. But yeah, I appreciate you mentioning. I had a team with Evan Silva that also finished in the top 30. A couple teams in the top 30 that team with you as well. And I also want to shout out Teague Orgeman, who was the overall champion. He DM'd me on Twitter, said he was a Bananas listener, so that was really cool to hear. Congratulations to him. Hopefully he's listening to our thoughts on the playoff contest as well. I'm looking at his team now. It was a Breece Hall, Jackson Smith, and Jigba team. He drafted Rashad Penny, which was my worst call of the year. I was very excited about Rashad Penny all offseason. I'm not saying that we got him on all those players. He also got Kyron Williams in the 14th round, which is, he was in on him aggressively, and that paid off handsomely. Kyron Williams, famously somebody that I was not really in on at all until.
But Ben, we can now make the claim accurately: Jackson Smith and Jigba, tournament winner.
Right, yeah, tournament winner. I mean, we nailed that. But obviously, the Breece Hall thing, less of a joke that he really was a huge piece in the way that he hit late. A lot of really fun stuff to come out of this year, to come out of that tournament. You mentioned so many people reaching out to us, and it was so cool. I was traveling on that Sunday. I went to the semifinal game in New Orleans on that Monday. I had limited connectivity and everything. I didn't have the ability to respond to all the messages I wanted to. I didn't have an ability to write, a Stealing Signals post like I wanted to. So I do just really quickly want to say, for all of our listeners on Stealing Bananas, at least, all of the messages, all the stuff that flooded in about all the, the championships that people won. It was really, really cool. You get that every year when you're an analyst. It's a fun time of the year at the end of the year because you get people that are excited and they give you more credit than you deserve as the analyst, frankly. But this year was the one that I think more than any other, I got a lot of messages. And really, when we talk about the strategy and a lot of the stuff that we went through this year, Sean, the wide receiver starts and the running backs in the dead zone, and it's a pretty unique structure and build and plan that we had for a lot of our teams that went well for us. And I think it also went really well for most of the listeners. Didn't go perfect for everyone, I'm sure, but I think a lot of people had a lot of success this year in a way that is very fulfilling for me, and I know for you as well, Sean. So just want to say thanks to everyone for those messages, and what a fun year for the community and for everybody who listens. So that's really cool. Wanted to make sure to highlight that in our first show here in 2024. But yeah, Sean, when we talk about this playoff contest, which is just so much fun, it really is that element that you brought up about the one and dones. It gets locked in. Those scores get locked in. And what's so interesting about this format, I was just talking obviously about how some players are going to play multiple games, some are going to play 3-4 games. And you're going to get all of these additional scores later in the contest. And when you talk about the Super Bowl scoring being 2 times the double points, nothing's going to be clear until the Super Bowl's been played. One thing that can be clear is you can be blocked, right? Going into the Super Bowl, you can have your 2 players on a lot of teams above you. And so you're trying to avoid that in the early rounds. You're trying to become the best team that has those remaining players. You mentioned our team last year with the Richie James thing. what would have happened in that Richie James game if they in that Giants game if Richie James scores is we would have been blocking someone as opposed to being blocked is what ended up happening in the way that went. And then it went well from there, but we were behind a bunch of other teams. He was a big pivot play for us, and that was in the round 2 contest after this weekend. What happens in the main contest this weekend is there are 6 games. 6 teams will lose. They will play only 1 game. All of those fantasy scores will be locked for the whole playoffs on 6 teams. There's 14 teams in the playoffs. Almost half of the playoff field will be locked after the first weekend. And that is the part of it that you were kind of alluding to where you want to be able to hit on potentially some contrarian plays. The really ideal thing from those 6 teams that lose would be that you have your 2 fades in there. You have your kicker and your defense in there, and they're the highest scoring kicker and the highest scoring defense of the weekend, ideally. And then you have 2 skill position players. You don't have a quarterback, but 2 skill position players from a loser, from those 6 teams. That's the way you would really prefer your first 6 games results to go in your lineup. And those 2 skill position players need to be the highest 2 scoring skill position players of the 6 losing teams on opening weekend. Not necessarily the winning teams. They're going to go on and play more games, and different things can happen to their scores, their teammates' scores, what have you, the rest of the way. But certainly for the losing teams that lock. And that's the part of this that offers a lot of strategy opportunity, because people love to play the chalkier, comfier plays in this, in part because they don't want to predict the outcomes. And so it's, well, if this team wins and advances and goes on, I want to be able to maintain this player the rest of the way. A great example is last year, you go to the round 1 tournament, the Vikings and Giants played in round 1, and Justin Jefferson was really heavy chalk. And Sean, you and I talked a lot about playing TJ Hawkinson as a pivot off of Jefferson, because in a 1-game scenario where the Vikings lost to the Giants, we thought Hawkinson had the potential to outscore Jefferson. One of the ways the Giants might be able to beat the Vikings is if they could shut down Justin Jefferson. We played a lot of Hawkinson with Saquon Barkley, because you're then correlating the Giants winning. And if the Giants are winning, then you have Saquon Barkley playing a second game and also playing potentially in some positive game script, and in a game that they won, that they're going to generate some points. They went on to get blown out in the second round, but they did win in the first game and score some points, and Barkley had a pretty solid game in that first matchup. I think we also played some Hawkinson and some of the Giants receivers as well. But playing that game differently than the market by playing Hawkinson over Jefferson, because in a 1-game scenario, you can get enough scoring variance, especially on the pass catcher side, where this superstar player, Justin Jefferson, going into the tournament last year, obviously had coming off an incredible season. He ends up being the 101 the following year. He was thought more highly at this point last year than he is maybe right this moment after coming off an injury-plagued 2023. But that type of a pivot is a type of pivot that a lot of people don't want to make, because they don't want to pick that game. They don't want to pick the Vikings to lose. They can keep 2 options open. If they take Jefferson, they keep the Vikings winning option open. And if the Vikings do win in advance, then you want to have Jefferson over multiple games, right? I mean, that feels a lot more comfortable than playing Hawkinson over multiple games to beat Jefferson. And that rule about only having 1 player from each team does make it this thing of how much can this player outscore his teammates, right? And so that is a major constraint, and it is a major element of the opening weekend games to consider what team you think might win, and if you're willing to actually pick some of those games, because there's going to be a lot of people that are not going to want to pick some of the games with the good teams. They're not going to want to pick Miami and Kansas City because they think the winner of that could win 3 games. And so they want to have a player from both sides to keep all their options open. But by picking those types of games, you do create a lot of opportunity in the opening weekend, because remember, again, among the 6 losers, you basically want to get the 2 highest scoring skill position players. And it is possible, obviously, that the Vikings lose last year and Justin Jefferson is one of the 2 highest scoring skill position players of the opening weekend. It's possible that the Dolphins lose and Tyreek Hill is that player. It's also possible that they're not, right? And that there are 2 other scores. Last year, it was DK Metcalf for the Seahawks in a loss, had a big game, and outscore Justin Jefferson. And so you're looking for those types of players as well on opening weekend who can put up big numbers in a loss. And as you said, if you can find it as a contrarian play and lock yourself in early to some of these results that give you high scores that not a lot of other people were playing in a loss, you can put yourself in really great position starting the second weekend and beyond as we start to see more games played and more scores accumulated.
And so when we look at these 6 games for this week, we have a lot of different opportunities in that 4 of the games do project to be relatively close. That doesn't mean that they will be, obviously, but you have 4 games that the market expects to be competitive, and then we have 2 games with, especially Bills Steelers that the Bills are heavy favorites in. So you're going to have the Steelers faded at extremely high levels. And I think that especially when you look at the, implied totals for the Steelers, that makes sense. Although I did float a contrarian play to you that I haven't been able to quite get you on board with, for very good reasons. The other game that is not projected to be particularly close is Cowboys Packers. And yet the over under in that one, the game environment, the lack of weather concern, the explosiveness of the Packers offense actually makes that a very compelling game to select a Packer and to get a high score in a loss where that player is not on a ton of other rosters. And so we really have a lot to work through in this particular contest that I think makes it so much fun, because maybe you don't have to go quite as far out of your way to create the necessary pivots to not be heavily duplicated. And so as we start to build this team out, Ben, what game appeals to you the most jumping into how we want to build our teams out?
I guess I haven't really thought through about which game. I think your point about the Packers is a great one. That's a game that has a high over-under, but because the Packers are touchdown underdogs, 7.5-point underdogs on some books, people are going to want to play them through their kicker or their defense. Again, you kind of need to pick a loser for those spots or the full fade spots. The Steelers certainly will be faded very, very heavily. But the Packers, as you noted, are in this game environment that could be favorable. And one of the things that adds to it, when you talk about you can only pick one player from each team, it becomes harder on the Packers. Like, yes, Jaden Reed is probably their top play, but you can at least think about Dontavian Wicks and Romeo Dobbs, and if Christian Watson's healthy, certainly Aaron Jones is in the mix as well at the running back position. And having to choose the player makes it harder, right? Makes it harder for people to then actually make that decision. Again, it's a really important element of this contest and every contest that you have to consider what everyone else is doing, because you don't want to just make the same picks as everybody else. That really does narrow your path to victory. You have to have some very specific things happen. And in some cases, you might also duplicate the lineups. And you might duplicate – in this contest, there are always some lineups that are duplicated many, many times. And it's very top-heavy. And it turns that $500,000 first prize into – not that this is a small amount of money, but it can be as low as like $10,000 in some cases where –
well, one of the top lineups in the Playoff 2 contest that did finish up near the top was duplicated a lot. But those entrants still – profited. So it doesn't guarantee that you're not going to be happy in the end, but it skews things in a way that's not favorable for you.
Right. And when you think about things from a gambler's perspective, expected value, those types of things, it's certainly not the optimal way to try to get the most value out of your bet at the time you're placing it. But to your point, I mean, for a lot of people, it's like, well, I mean, I'm still profiting and making a lot of money. And a lot of people, it's just an entertainment element. So, maybe that point doesn't resonate with everybody. Having said that, being able to pick out the spots, certainly anyone who's playing is trying to win the tournament, whether they're matching lineups with other people or not. Being able to pick out the spots where you're pulling a lever that not a lot of other people are pulling is how you maximize your chances of winning. It also requires dangerous fades. And that's a big part of this contest, is thinking through the players that you're not playing, that are going to be on a lot of rosters. Justin Jefferson was the example from last year that we started the show with. Tyreek Hill is one that I've already mentioned on this show. If you're picking the Chiefs to win, Tyreek Hill becomes a really interesting fade to pick the winner in that game, because a lot of people are still going to play Hill. He comes from a very concentrated offense. People do expect a lot of points in that game, although maybe they shouldn't, because it's projecting to be one of the coldest games on record in NFL history. I believe right now I saw that it's projected to be the third coldest game in NFL history. There is a possibility that this game is so cold that there's not a lot of scoring. Extreme levels of cold temperatures do impact, in the models and the weather models that have been shown, they do impact scoring. And that is a concern in this game. But people are not going to want to not play a Dolphin in a very concentrated offense. That's an example of a player that you could fade. On the other side of that game, you have Travis Kelce, who has not been the same tight end this year. I've heard a lot of people talk about him as the biggest fade in this contest. You also have the lineup constraint element. So Kelce becomes a fade because you have to play a tight end, and there are not as many great tight ends in the playoffs this year. You have Sam Laporta getting injured last year. Some of the decent ones are blocked by teammates, like a Jake Ferguson is tough to play when you have CeeDee Lamb on that roster. You're now fading CeeDee Lamb to get Ferguson in, and Ferguson has to beat Lamb directly, or at least there are paths to him not beating Lamb directly, but he at least has to do well. And then you need all the other tight ends to do poorly, such that Ferguson was the optimal tight end and the only way you could really fill the tight end slot. So you start to get those constraints as well. You have to have a tight end in there. And so sometimes you don't need him to be the highest scoring player on his team. You need him to be the highest scoring player at his position. And that part of it is concerning. The main two tight ends on the top of everybody's mind are going to be Kelce and David Njoku for the Browns, but it's not a deep tight end pool in the playoffs this year. But the Dolphins-Chiefs game is one, Sean. You're asking my favorite game. I think it's my favorite game from a game theory perspective, because I think there will be a lot of people that just want to take both sides of that game. And I think probably one of the clearest things you can do to build a quick edge as you build this lineup is to pick a winner in that game, and then either play the kicker / DST, which is what we're going to call soft fading, or hard fade, not play anybody from the opponent. The kicking game is also going to be tough in such a cold environment. And I think probably the Dolphins DST is tougher to play as well in a loss, because I think, Patrick Mahomes takes care of the ball pretty well. And if the Chiefs do win, you're probably not looking at a big defensive score in that type of game. Miami, interestingly, had one of the best opening weekend defensive scores last year when they had a defensive touchdown in a loss at Buffalo. And so you're kind of looking for identifying the DST that can maybe score you a touchdown or get some sacks or takeaways despite losing. But I don't know that is the right play in Miami. But yeah, to play a Kelce or even a Pacheco or a Rashee Rice from the Chiefs with kicker defense, or nobody from the Dolphins, or to play a Tyreek, or maybe you're going to Achane or Raheem Mostert with Butker or the Kansas City defense, or not playing anybody from the Chiefs. That's going to be a quick way, I think, to get your lineup pretty unique in this field. And I think it does make some sense.
And the Kansas City-Miami game is just so interesting because in addition to the game theory elements that you mentioned, where I think even full fading the loser of this game being a very sharp play, you also have some matchup-based elements that make this really interesting. And so if we're looking at it for all of these teams that lose being a 1 week tournament, the matchups do come into play. So you look at Kansas City, you look at some of the narratives with Tyreek Hill and how it certainly benefits the Chiefs and their front office if they don't get bounced from the playoffs by a player that they traded and then couldn't effectively replace. And so that's the narrative. But beyond that, you have them limiting Hill in their first matchup, despite the fact that this was actually the season high for Hill in snap percentage, right? He went for less than half of his seasonal average in terms of yards per route in that game. when we ignore their Week 18 exhibition, where obviously they're resting players, the Chiefs come in over the second half of the season with one of the NFL's best pass defenses. They rank number 2 in pressure rate, number 3 in success rate, number 3 in boom percentage. They really shut down fantasy points over expectation to the receivers. Getting those most recent stats there from Blair Andrews and his fantastic weekly wrong read piece. This is a game where if you want to maybe pick the Dolphins, I still think it might be an interesting opportunity to get off of Hill and look at the running backs in a game where, again, passing and scoring may be difficult, but Achane, somebody who came out, he had 5 evaded tackles in Week 18. He did everything he could to try and pull the Dolphins into a much better seed, a much better playoff situation. And the Chiefs are bottom 5 in yards after contact allowed. So Mostert, if he's healthy, or Achane, if he ends up being the bell cow, I mean, you could be looking at a big game from those guys. I think it's kind of interesting if you're just playing like 2 running backs to have Achane as one of them and have him going out. So if you're not going to fade the loser in this game, I think that that's an interesting play. There's so many things you can do with this particular matchup to make your overall lineup work for the tournament itself.
And that's something we have seen where the running, like, it's bizarre because running back is obviously such a position of game script, and when teams win and they advance further, you expect, okay, well, this running back's playing a bunch of game scripts, he's going to put up points. But the whole team is putting up points. And the further along you go, the more likely that the passing offense has done a lot for that team as well. And then you're talking about the quarterback potentially being the right quarterback to play, or the number 1 pass catcher being the right pass catcher. There are not a lot of offenses in the modern NFL that you think through how they're going to make a strong run, and it's basically the running back that's the big-time scorer. And a big part of that is because of the mobility of the quarterbacks, right? So you think through the Ravens and the Bills and the Eagles last year with Jalen Hurts, when those teams make a run, their quarterbacks are adding a lot of rushing yards to passing stats and are suddenly the clear play. And so it does get challenging. You go back several years and maybe you start to think through, teams that went on big time playoff runs and their running backs had strong runs. None is actually coming, specifically to my mind. You may have to go back even further than I'm doing in my mind, but I'm thinking about like a Derrick Henry obviously the Titans didn't make the Super Bowl, but in some of their playoff games, they are winning through their running back, right? I mean, there's offenses built that way, but not as many in the modern NFL. So probably the chalk running backs in the overall. I mentioned that Kelsey and Njoku are sort of the main tight ends. The chalk running backs are probably going to be Christian McCaffrey, who's the obvious counter to all of these points, and then Kyren Williams is a guy who ends up having the 3 touchdowns in the fantasy championship. You can definitely see him score multiple touchdowns in a loss, the way that the Rams use their running backs in the red zone, how extreme his usage is in those key spots. It would not be surprising if we get a Rams-Lions game that has some scoring in it, that the Rams give him some short touchdowns, but then they also end up losing that game in Detroit. They are underdogs on the road in a game with a high total indoors. And so Kyren Williams is going to be a popular running back play, even in a loss, as you described with Achane. But then when you start to think about those pivots, you say, okay, well, what if Kyren Williams loses and the Dolphins lose? Is it, Nakua and Achane, or Kupp and Achane? Can they outscore Kyren and Tyreek and in a loss? And then I'm getting way off of the heavier ownership play with Tyreek and Kyren Williams. And that 2v2 is, a subtle way to start to get a little bit different. And in a 1-game outcome, certainly the answer there is sort of a rhetorical question is yes, obviously they can outscore them. That 2v2 can outscore. Again, we talked through the constraints and how you're going to have 2 losing teams in opening weekend that you have to have a skill position player from. As we look at the overall slate, we're talking through Miami and Kansas City as a game that people are going to want to play both sides of. They're going to want to play one of their 2 losing skill position players out of that game. The other game is this Rams and Lions one that I think screams to people. It's a closer game total. It feels like more of a toss-up, closer spread. Feels like more of a toss-up. Feels like there's going to be plenty of scoring. And then you have the Packers and Cowboys games that we talked about. That's got a little bit of a bigger spread, but you can pivot to playing a Packer and to get some skill position differentiality. Even if you're playing the Packers to lose, you can play a Packer because that looks like a game environment that's going to have points. You have the Steelers-Bills as the other blowout. You mentioned some plays there that you're interested in. This is the kind of off-the-wall one because I look at it and I go, I don't know how I can justify playing a Steeler. So that's one where I kind of want to go with the crowd and fade. And then you have two other games that are the 4-5 matchups on both sides. You have the Browns and Texans, and you have the Eagles and Bucks. They're both a field goal or closer in spread, but they're also not so exciting that people are going to be jumping to play both sides of these games. The Bucks game is expected to have some lightning, potentially, certainly some rain, some thunderstorms on Monday night in Tampa. The Texans game's indoors in Houston, where they at least have a roof there, obviously. In both games, the crowd is probably more likely to not play both sides of it, to potentially take their kicker or their defense out of these games. Cleveland Browns defense is going to be popular. The kickers in the Eagles-Bucks game could be popular because that game does have a high over-under, even with some weather and some rain. But I think both of those are interesting ones to look at if you're saying, I'm willing to pick a winner in the Dolphins-Chiefs game, like we talked about, and only play one skill position with a soft fade or a hard fade on the other side. If you're willing to do that in the Rams-Lions as well, that's another way to get unique, and you can certainly do it in Rams-Lions. Little trickier, I guess, because the Rams and Lions are pretty concentrated offenses, and that's in a dome. You don't get the same, we talked about the weather situation influencing the Dolphins-Chiefs, but to me, like even if the Rams go out, they're probably still going to have some points scored on their skill position side because it is pretty concentrated in their offense. The Lions without Laporta is going to push Amon-Ra St. Brown's ownership very, very high. And it also, to me, is hard to imagine him or the running backs don't do anything in a loss at home. So it's a trickier one. I can understand why people are going to want to play both sides of that. But if you do pick one of those sides and fade the opposite side, it's the Browns, Texans, Eagles, Bucks that become interesting games, I think, to look at. In addition to, we talked about playing a Packer. But those are two opportunities to get unique in game environments that could have plenty of skill position scoring as well. We just saw the Browns in Houston a few weeks back. Amari Cooper had a monster game. I mean, that's the type of – and the Texans players scored on the other side as well a decent amount. That's the type of scoring environment that can lead to, you wishing or the optimal being having played both sides of that Cleveland and Houston game. And a similar thing can be true in that Eagles and Bucks game. That's one that popped to me right away, that I think playing the skill guys on both sides of the Tampa-Philly game is really an interesting way of doing it. And when we talked, that was one of your first thoughts as well. You liked playing the Bucks and potentially even fading the Eagles, picking the Bucks to win as one way of doing this as well.
I do really like that. I think that with how the Eagles have collapsed, I think that's one that it's not that hard to lean into unless you think a huge percentage of people are going to. But the Bucks have three very interesting players. And again, it's going to depend a little bit on the weather. If you're scared of the weather, I think that you can go to Rachaad White. He's a great option in that game. And one of the things that we're looking at with Bucks Eagles is that the Eagles defense is terrible in basically every way. And so you don't have to worry as much about the initial round matchup as you do in some of the other games that we're going to look at. But you can play White. You can obviously play Mike Evans. Chris Godwin's numbers are really good over the last month, and he's going to show up on very few rosters. And so if you want some of the chalkier pieces elsewhere, I think the Godwin is an easy play to go to, and you're probably not losing as many projected points as maybe it feels like. Certainly not as many as his overall season would indicate. So there are some opportunities there. Ben, the game here that you kind of referenced that I think is really interesting as a starting point, a foundation for your roster, is that Lions-Rams game. And it is one that I'm unlike the Chiefs Dolphins, where I think that you could have a very, very low score, which seems surprising, or it's counterintuitive if you don't know how the Chiefs have played this season. You don't know about the Dolphins' injuries. You're not really factoring in the weather. But once you throw all those things in, the idea of that being very low scoring, I think, is pretty easy to wrap your mind around. Lions-Rams, I think, is going to be a huge shootout. And we look at the Lions. You can pull up our game splits app. You can see how, they're basically +9 in home games, whereas they have a negative point differential on the road. One of the reasons why, even after losing Sam Laporta and even against a surging Rams team, we think about what the Rams had to do to make the playoffs. We think about how competitive they were recently on the road against the Ravens, probably the best team in football. I guess I'm almost a little bit surprised that this game isn't even closer in terms of the line. People are going to love the Rams as an upset, and they should, but the Lions are good at home, right? And you also look at the fact here that the Rams have been just getting absolutely torched by opposing number one receivers. You think about Amon-Ra. We know how good he is. We know how many points he's going to score. As a foundation piece, maybe somebody you don't pivot off of. He looks good for this home game. And then the interesting thing here, and I would encourage people not put too much stock in this, but also not be too scared of him, in that players like Jared Goff has huge home road splits, but that's not the case for Amon-Ra this season, in part because I think he becomes even a bigger part. And again, you can see this in the game splits app, but they have to rely on him even more when they are on the road and struggling. He's going to get the volume there. So when you think about a situation, and just, go back to a couple weeks ago where they, again, it depends a little bit on how you're looking at it, but probably should have beaten the Cowboys in Dallas. Even with the Laporta injury, there is a path for the Lions to really do well in this tournament. They were very close to being, I think, the number 3 team after obviously the 49ers and the Ravens. Before you have that Laporta injury, before you had the seeds get mixed up, obviously it's much more difficult if you're going to have to go on the road in that second game. So I think you can play Amon-Ra as a foundation piece as opposed to getting off of him. Although, again, so much flexibility here, because if David Montgomery had a 3-touchdown game, that's not going to surprise anybody, and he's not going to be on very many rosters, right? If Jahmyr Gibbs has a 2-touchdown game with 170 yards from scrimmage, half on the ground, half through the air, again, that's not going to shock people, and he's not going to be on a huge number of rosters. So many
people aren't going to want to decide between the running backs, so they're just going to click Amon-Ra.
And so I like those players. I like the Rams receivers off of it. And it does seem like Cooper Kupp is going to have relatively low rostership. And in that case, you just think back to a couple weeks ago where he drops isn't exactly the right word, but should have had or could have had multiple touchdowns in that game. If you want to take a superstar in a rising offense who you have a chance to play him without him actually being the chalky guy, this would be your opportunity. Now, not saying that you have to do that, but it's a way where if you want to retain a powerful lineup and also move off of the most highly rostered players, that seems like a great opportunity there. And even in a multi-game situation, I'm not scared of having Cooper Kupp on my roster. Obviously, I'm not scared of having Puka there either. That's one of the guys who really pulled us through. We have a lot of good feeling toward him. I like both sides of that game. Whereas then you move to Browns-Texans, as you discussed. And Ben, one of the things I think is kind of interesting here is that the specific matchups in this game, offense to defense, becomes pretty interesting. But the other element is that the Browns have become so trendy that in the underdog format drafting this week, and there are 6 different underdog contests going for it, they are so expensive that I just don't think you can play them at all in that contest. If you're trying to balance out some of the exposure that you're getting or some of the ways that you're playing through teams across the 2 contests, and maybe you're not, but I think the Browns become vaguely interesting in this game where, like you mentioned, weather shouldn't be a factor. And they also present this opportunity to where if you wanted to make a move that then doesn't require hardly any additional pivots, if you want to pick them over the Ravens in the second round and fade the Ravens, then you've gotten yourself into a situation where you could play a pretty powerful roster otherwise.
The Ravens are a really interesting one because Lamar Jackson's going to be the chalk quarterback, him and Josh Allen. I think they're going to make up a really high percentage of the quarterback plays. And you kind of understand why, because there aren't really strong alternatives in the AFC. It feels a lot like it's going to be the Ravens or Bills this year. The obvious alternative is the Kansas City Chiefs. And then there are some other possibilities. I mean, maybe the Browns make a run or something. Maybe the Dolphins make a run. It's not out of the question, right? Maybe CJ Stroud just goes absolutely nuclear in his rookie season playoffs. Who knows? But if one of those two teams does make it, it feels like those guys are going to be the optimal quarterback. And so you get Lamar as the likely chalk quarterback. But there is I've heard a lot of discussion already on this soft fade idea as well, that, hey, what if they go one and done in the playoffs? People don't love their skill positions, right? You have Mark Andrews out. You don't have a clear running back. Zay Flowers is pretty clearly the guy that you would play, I think, if you're going to play a skill player for the Ravens. But he doesn't pack as much of a punch, I guess, as, like an Amon-Ra St. Brown or what have you. Having said that, it's one of those unique elements of this contest where you have to think through the bracket, and you have to think through the team, and you have to think through the ways that things play out. Scenarios where the Ravens play two games, where they don't get up. If they get upset in the first game, I understand how you could soft fade them, maybe play their kicker or their defense. If they make the Super Bowl, it does seem very likely that Lamar getting 3 games and that double point game in the Super Bowl, he becomes the optimal quarterback in most scenarios. But if the Ravens win their first game and then they lose in the AFC Championship to a Bills or to a Chiefs or whoever they face in the AFC Championship, and that is a pretty likely outcome. I would say of the 3 outcomes for the Ravens, it is the most likely of the 3. Meaning they are less likely to make the run all the way to the Super Bowl, and they are less likely to lose in the first round. It seems more likely, and maybe that's not fair. Maybe they're more likely to make the run to the Super Bowl than to lose specifically in the second round. But that is their tough matchup in the second round. Feels like a coin flip. The run to the Super Bowl obviously requires 2 wins, is sort of the way that I'm thinking about it. So maybe I would defend that as the most likely scenario. In that scenario where they play 2 games, Lamar's probably not the optimal quarterback. Especially if they're losing to the Bills and you're getting 4 games out of Josh Allen now, he's probably the optimal quarterback. But you're also probably not talking about the kicker or defense as the clear option in a 2-game situation. It's probably whoever leads that skill position group, whether that is Zay Flowers or maybe it's Odell or Isaiah Likely or what have you. Flowers being the pretty clear play, I think he becomes an interesting option in those 2-game scenarios. The scenarios where you're picking the Ravens to lose in the AFC Championship, I don't think a lot of people want to pull that lever. I've heard a lot of, I want to play the Ravens through Jackson or just soft fade them, as if that 2-game scenario is extremely unlikely, as if the Ravens are either going to lose in their first game, which we've seen them struggle in the playoffs before, or they're going to get over the hump this year and go all the way to the Super Bowl, and those are the only outcomes. And it just doesn't seem to fit for me with the actual distribution of likelihoods here and probabilities of what they're going to do. And if they play the 2 games because they have a bye in the first game, that's the type of team, 2-game team, where you do see the highest scoring skill player overwhelmingly be the optimal pick. And no one's going to want to make the play into Flowers, like I said. So I think he becomes a pretty interesting play when you think through some of the Ravens' outcomes.
And for Flowers and the Ravens specifically, since the Mark Andrews injury, he's absolutely taken off again. He scores so many points in this contest, in this type of contest, that he should be extremely heavily rostered. And if you're getting any sense that maybe that's not going to be the case, you really want to lean into that. Now, then if we're looking at a Ravens Super Bowl team, one of the other elements here that I do think is interesting is that you have the Bills, and you have to take a player off of that squad, assuming you don't think that they're going to somehow blow the game to Pittsburgh. Something that I think, even though it's just one guy, and it doesn't mean that the Pittsburgh Steelers defense couldn't score, but without TJ Watt, it seems like an even much narrower path for the Bills to go out in the first round. So you're looking at a Bills player. Stephon Diggs' peripherals, you look at his overall scoring, it's cratered since the coordinator switch. You look at something like his depth of target, and it's cratered since the coordinator switch. Dalton Kincaid, somebody who is interesting because you have to play a tight end. It's a little bit tricky to get to a tight end if you don't want to play David Njoku for whatever reason. And he's someone who was breaking out before the coordinator switch. You've got some interesting things then going on there. You have Dawson Knox as a little bit of a complicating factor now that he is back and healthy. But we do have 5 games this season from Kincaid that are above 18 points in this premium format, including the crucial game that just occurred in week 18. I guess I would find Stephon Diggs as maybe someone I wouldn't want in any roster everywhere. And that's not to necessarily criticize him or say that he couldn't score. We love Stephon Diggs, but that doesn't seem to me to be the way to play it. James Cook, somebody who immediately blew up after the coordinator change, and then he just continues to make mistakes. You think about the drop touchdown pass last week, it's then dropped off again, where he no longer looks like he's emerging as an Alvin Kamara or Austin Eckler type in their offense, which for me is kind of sad. It would have been cool if he had done that. But again, we have some hints even stretching back to him being a good but not great collegiate player, which, if he's going to emerge as some of those other guys you would like to have seen him do it better than he has to this point. If you're not playing Josh Allen, the Bills are wide open, and that makes them, I think, an exploitable team here too, if we assume that, they're going to go through several rounds of this tournament.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because Diggs, the reason I agree with you there, and the reason I wouldn't love playing him is that it is really hard to talk yourself into James Cook or even Dalton Kincaid or any of these other guys. And so it becomes he's the Bill by default, sort of how I was just talking about Zay Flowers, where, the Bills are 10-point favorites in the first round. We're projecting them to play multiple games. But if you're not projecting them to go all the way to the Super Bowl and you're not making this a Josh Allen team, you're playing Lamar Jackson, you are likely, I think the field is likely to then default to Diggs. His ownership is going to be pushed up because Gabe Davis is banged up as well. Because of a lack of clear alternatives, I do like Cook as a potential pivot because I do think he has the explosiveness and the profile to where he can score more than the other skill position players on his team in a win and in a loss. It may require him to hit on a long touchdown, but he also gets air yards in the passing game, right? So it could require him to catch, or could the way he gets there, it could be him catching a 30-yard touchdown pass or something like that. So that's an element that I think is actually really intriguing to this idea of, we're in a couple of games. Does he have the requisite ceiling to outscore his teammates? Another player who does and is similar and that I like as a really interesting pivot to fill these running back slots is Aaron Jones. They will throw downfield to him some. And he's also, it's funny, I bring him up because James Cook's best game, the one that we saw him really go off, was against the Cowboys, who the Packers are now playing. They are sort of similar players. I could see the Packers trying to leverage Aaron Jones in a game plan the way that the Bills were able to leverage James Cook to really combat Dallas's pass rush and pass defense. And so you think about it from an X's and O standpoint, schematic standpoint, I could see Aaron Jones be somebody that is central to what the Packers want to do, unleashing him. He's from Texas, went to UTEP. He's had some good games in Dallas before. So anyway, he's another interesting one. But Cook is tricky because since that game, he has not been very good. As you noted, Diggs is that pushes Diggs' ownership up more. In addition to certainly Allen's going to carry a lot of ownership. No one's going to play Kincaid, and I do really like that point. It's hard to find a third tight end in this in this contest, but everybody wants to fade Kelsey. I think it's going to push a lot of people onto Njoku. I do think it makes Kelsey an interesting play at a potentially depressed ownership relative to some of the projections that he may come in lower, because I just keep hearing people not wanting to play him. And yet with tight end being so weak, if the Chiefs are able to string together a couple of games, think, how do they win? Well, they probably get Travis Kelsey going, because I don't really expect them to win a lot of games if they can't get something going in the pass catching department. And obviously Kelsey is their best bet there. That, yeah, he's had a really tough season, but he puts it together in a playoff run where he looks a lot like his old self, himself, what he was last year. I don't think that's out of the question at all for Travis Kelsey. So I think he's really interesting. But if you don't want to go Kelsey and you don't want to go Njoku, it does get really thin. Dallas Goedert's an option if you think, we don't know a ton about A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith's health, but if they don't look really healthy, the tricky thing is obviously this locks. That's a Monday night game. We're not even necessarily going to have all the clarity there, but Dallas Goedert maybe is an option in a loss if you wanted to play the Eagles as a losing team, but you wanted to play Goedert. But I don't love a third tight end option. Kincaid is an interesting one you bring up, because I don't think people are going to pull that lever. They're going to think the Bills are going to play multiple games, and they're not going to think Kincaid can do it over multiple games. But you make a compelling case, and it's not hard to imagine Diggs not doing it. And it's not hard to imagine Cook not necessarily doing it, and things being spread around a little bit. And if the other tight ends don't smash, Kincaid is good enough over multiple games, maybe 2 games, maybe 3, probably not 4, because that's when you get into the Josh Allen in the optimal territory. But in 2 or 3 games, Kincaid's good enough that he's the optimal tight end because of the constraints on that position group as well. But I do like Cook as well because of the constraints on the running back position group. It's another reason to consider fading Diggs, is that you can fill harder to fill positions. And it's not crazy to envision that either Cook or Kincaid can be not the engine that drives the offense, but a strong enough scoring piece of a Bills run that nonetheless doesn't reach the Super Bowl. Say a Ravens Super Bowl Lamar Jackson team, you can make a Cook or a Kincaid pivot off of Diggs. Those are really interesting plays.
And as you bring up the tight ends there, I think it kind of pushes us here, kind of as we conclude, back to the NFC in the San Francisco 49ers, and how do you play them? Christian McCaffrey, the very obvious way to do it, but Ben, anytime that I look through this team, I'm absolutely blown away by the numbers. Deebo Samuel season, fantastic. Brandon Ayuk season, fantastic. It kind of gets back to the claim that we were making during our Brock Purdy MVP show about a month ago now, where, again, I mean, this skill position group is historically good. If you really like the Rams, and I think there are reasons to really like them, if you like them through Detroit, and you're playing Kyren Williams, and you want to, again, differentiate your lineup without actually going to weaker players. For me, probably the most likely game for the 49ers to lose before the Super Bowl, I mean, obviously you can lose to the Cowboys, you can lose to the Lions if those teams come through. But the team I think that the 49ers themselves have to be the most scared of is the Rams.
The Rams. Yeah.
And so you have an initial loss by the 49ers. And I mean, George Kittle, you almost just don't even think about him. And when I was looking at, that he's good, you draft him in different formats, but before I, pulled it up and working on this article, then he's got 5 games with 20 plus points this year, right? In this format, 5 games like that. He's got 12 in the last 2 of 19 or more. Right. So if you have the 49ers lose, the idea that George Kittle would outscore these other 3 superstars, that could very, very easily happen. And then you have your unique lineup. Then you have your big tight end score.
That could happen. The tricky thing is he also, with the constraints on tight end, that's helpful, but there are constraints on running back as well. He also has to outscore McCaffrey, and you have to get 2 other running backs to put up decent enough totals to get ahead of McCaffrey as well. Maybe it is Kyren Williams, who you just said you're drawing this path through San Francisco. but you also have to have another running back score well enough and be sort of the best play in their offense. You mentioned 5 games of 20-plus points. I just pulled up Christian McCaffrey's game log. Is it every game? I think he had 4 games under 20 points. So it's nearly every single game of 20-plus points for McCaffrey. Certainly, if you're playing them as a one and done against the Rams, maybe the Rams are able to do something to really limit McCaffrey. But because of the constraints on the running back position, and because Purdy doesn't really add a ton of mobility, and so even in scenarios where the Niners make the Super Bowl, you're probably not thinking it's the clear quarterback. And because of the Niners' strong likelihood to make the Super Bowl, you're talking about some scenarios where they can lose. And you do want to think through contrarian scenarios if you're making a few different teams, or even if you're just making one and you want to pick something unique. But because of all of that, I find it hard. I think Christian McCaffrey is what I would call good chalk. I find it hard to not play him because I just want to fill one of those running back spots. I think in one and done scenarios through 3-game Super Bowl scenarios, I like him to be their highest scoring player and to fit into the puzzle as one of the 2 highest scoring running backs. Not a huge surprise. He's Christian McCaffrey, but that's sort of the way that I've been approaching San Francisco. It is an interesting contest. And one of the biggest things you should take from this whole episode, Shawn, is that you do want to look for places to be unique and levers to pull in those things. You also want to think through when you are getting contrarian, because one of the mistakes I see is people get too contrarian. When you are getting contrarian, you are fading something. Fading Christian McCaffrey, for example, could prove to really kill you when he's in 80% of the lineups in the contest. When you fade, you have to be right. You are not playing somebody, and you have to be correct on that play. And you don't have to fade everyone. One of the mistakes that I see is that people try to pivot off of the clear chalk play on every team. But this is a 12-man roster. This isn't DFS. There are smaller lineups in DFS, and you can stack, right? So when you fade something, you can correlate your quarterback and receivers and make it so that you have to get fewer things correct in a smaller lineup in DFS to pay off a fade of a high-owned player who's maybe, by the way, only owned 30% or 40%. That's high-owned in those formats. In this format, you're talking about fading an 80% owned player sometimes. You're not able to correlate anything. And even if you're right, you're not necessarily going to win because you can't correlate, and you have 12 roster spots. You have to be right all the way across the board. It is a very interesting and intriguing contest, and it's super, super fun to play. You do want to find your pivots, but it's okay, and it's not wrong the way that we are taught in our contrarian nature in other contests like DFS or some of the other large field things where the ownership can be very high. It is not wrong to say I'm going to eat chalk in this contest with a 12-man roster. That's a really important point to drive home. For me, I think CMC is one of the chalk plays that I'm really comfortable eating, meaning playing him, even though he's going to be really high owned, because the payoff of not playing him, I'm not even sure will be that extreme. If you are going to do it, I like the way that you did it with Kittle, because what you're doing is you're knocking out that tight end position as well. And it opens up more paths to Kittle being right if the other tight ends are not high scoring. If Kelsey's poor, if Njoku's poor in a loss for the Browns, Kittle can be right in a big way at the tight end position in a one and done. So I can understand like that type of a logic, but you want to think through these things and the constraints of the contest when you're making your fades, when you're making your pivots. Is the payoff worth it? That's why you went to Kittle, and obviously that does make a ton of sense because the tight end position can make it worth it. But it's a super fun contest, Shawn. What do you say to close out the show? We build out a team. We'll go back and forth, pick players, and kind of show that combination of chalk and pivots and what a team might look like. That sound like fun?
It does. When I pick Najee Harris, it's going to throw off the entire rest of
the Najee Harris play is the one that I gotta just trust you sometimes, but I like your Kincaid. Your Kincaid played more than your Najee one. But you can start us off. Who do you want to pick first? Is Najee your opening your opening play?
Let's start with the very straightforward foundation piece, this idea of the chalk that we do want, and go with Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Okay. Amon-Ra. I will then take CMC after I just said that and also put in a chalk piece that I think I want in most lineups.
So you're very aggressively blocking me from George Kittle. I do like that. I'm going to take Zay Flowers next.
Zay Flowers is a fun selection. We just talked through how he makes a lot of sense in 2-game Ravens scenarios with CMC in the Super Bowl as well. That to me becomes likely a Josh Allen team, or potentially the Chiefs are making a run to the Super Bowl. I don't know if you want to get so thin to be getting to the other quarterbacks in the AFC. So just sort of explaining my thinking to the listeners, I'm going to go Josh Allen here. You could theoretically do Purdy if you were going to do Kansas City or one of the other less mobile quarterbacks from the AFC, but we already took CMC here. I think Allen, CMC, Flowers is sort of a smartly correlated bracket. You can correlate, I guess, in your bracket, right?
And so then I'm going to take Njoku, who I do think should be the highest rostered tight end, and I think should be the highest rostered tight end by a wide margin. You were saying that Amari Cooper is going to be on a lot of teams. We know that he crushed the Texans recently, but I like Njoku there.
So I'm going to take this is a relatively chalky lineup already. We really like taking a buck, and we have not picked that Bucs-Eagles game yet. I think Evans is going to be low enough owned to be a really interesting selection. But I think this is a team with mostly chalky pieces so far where it makes sense to go down to Chris Godwin. I think I'm going to put Chris Godwin onto this team.
And I'm going to force us to figure out a Dolphins piece, even though I mentioned liking them as a full fade. I'm going to give us Harrison Butker.
Wow. Well, we are picking the Dolphins to win outright. I do like Tyreek Hill in that. I mean, he's such a dominant receiver of the passing, such a dominant share of the passing game. Jalen Waddle being banged up. I'm going to go ahead and take Tyreek in that spot.
Let's go ahead and pick the Cleveland Browns since we have David Njoku on the roster here. And I think they're going to go through. They're going to score a lot of points. But we're also going to get some crazy fireworks there from Flacco. I mean, let's go with 3 or 4 interceptions in the victory and go with the Houston Texans defense.
Okay. Houston DST. So we have the Houston-Cleveland game. We have the Lions selected, but no Rams yet. We have not picked either the Cowboys or the Packers. We did take a buck, but no Eagles yet. We took a Bill, but no Steelers. It looks like it's going to be a full fade Steelers. We have both the Miami and KC and both the Browns and Texans. So most of our work here, we also do have both of the bye week teams, the Niners and Baltimore. Most of our work here is on the NFC side. We have, 1, 2, 3 spots remaining, 2 flexes and another running back spot between. We have to pick either side of the Packers-Cowboys game the Rams, which Kyron Williams, this is a pretty chalky lineup with Amon-Ra, with Tyreek Hill, but Godwin maybe is enough to be pretty unique here. Shawn, I'm going to go down similar to the Godwin play. Oh, I was going to say Cooper Kupp, but yeah, you know what? I'm going to do Cooper Kupp.
So that's going to leave us with Aaron Jones, which I love. 20 routes last week, 5 targets, and full fades of the Philadelphia Eagles and the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah, we have, and then we also have to add Aaron Jones and then CeeDee Lamb. We didn't pick yet, but he would be our final flex here, just taking the chalk in the Cowboys game as well, correct?
I believe so. And so that can give us Godwin and Kupp and Aaron Jones as pieces that will hopefully get us far enough along with Flowers, who you mentioned would be maybe lesser rostered than my intuition tells me. But as we were going through this, did you have any picks of mine that you winced at? I was hoping that you were going to take Achane.
Yeah, I was thinking about Achane, so that's the one you were hoping. That makes sense. No, none of yours were pretty straightforward, and I did like them. I'm looking at this trying to – there's a lot of chalk in this lineup, so Lamb's going to be extremely chalky. Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra, CMC, and Njoku may come in as the highest tight end still, probably under Kelsey, but you mentioned you thought he should be, and I think it may go that way. Flowers is going to have at least some ownership. Josh Allen is going to be one of the top 2 clear quarterbacks. Do you think it's contrarian enough with Godwin in there and with Aaron Jones? Or do we have too chalky of a line? I mean, one of the interesting things is part of what's not chalky here is the decision to play Harrison Butker, to full fade the Eagles. And so you can play some of the best plays and again, get unique on the plays that you're not playing. We picked Godwin in a win with a full fade of the Eagles. That's going to be very unique, right? And so playing that Bucs-Eagles game a certain way. There was no pick that you made, no, to answer your question. But as I look at this lineup, I'm kind of trying to think through or at least talk through our thought process, how the lineup comes together, and what listeners who want to try the contest can think as they get to the end of their lineup and try to decide if it's contrarian enough and those things. I think this does pass the bar. I think Godwin will be a really low-owned player, and I think Aaron Jones will. And then there are enough unique elements to this lineup in terms of the way that it plays the bracket when it fades both of last year's Super Bowl teams, or plays the kicker on one and it completely full fades the other. It might – I mean, I could see this lineup getting duped once or twice. I don't think it's a lineup that would be duped a bunch of times in this tournament.
As we close here, give the listeners a feel for what you think Jones versus Jaden Reed is going to be with the Packers. Obviously, you've discussed some of this stuff on Ship Chasing. Pat has his ownership projections, which are always fantastic, on Legendary Upside. How are we looking with Jones Reed versus, say, Williams Kupp, if we're manipulating those 2 spots as running back wide receiver?
Well, I think Williams and Reed will be the chalkier pieces in both offenses. And so part of the reason that I took Kupp there was because he looks to be, and looking at Pat's ownership, he has Nakua meaningfully ahead of Kupp as well. Kupp looks to be a reasonably good pivot. We talked about him earlier in the show. Shawn, you talked about you can have Cooper Kupp in your lineup, a superstar, and not have him even be very chalky. One of the points I made on Ship Chasing last night is if you told me at the beginning of the year Kupp would be healthy and the Rams would have made the playoffs and yet we'd be looking at him as like a 15% owned player in this contest, I would have a really, really hard time understanding that, because it is such a concentrated offense. It would have meant that somebody else, I mean, that's what's crazy is there's two other players that we are actually trusting more than Cooper Kupp by the end of this season. And so the concentrated offense element's still there, but we have Kyren and Nakua as these out of nowhere superstars. It's just one more way to talk about how great their seasons were this year. But I do think getting Kupp at that ownership number and then also getting Aaron Jones at a lower number than Reed likely will be fits for this lineup a little bit better. I think for like sort of in a vacuum, or if we had some other pivots in this lineup, if we would have played Achane, for example, but I guess that would have changed the running back equation because we're not probably looking to flex a running back necessarily in this spot, which doesn't mean that you can't in certain lineups, but just sort of the way this lineup was built. Essentially, I think the Kyren Reed side of it is a fun way to play it. I think Kyren would have made a lot of sense if we had some more pivots like Godwin in our flexes and in our wide receiver slots. But I had a hard time envisioning this lineup with Kyren and Reed and really Godwin being sort of the only pivot as well as the fades that we talked about. That to me felt a little bit too chalky of a build.
And so I do really like the exercise, and whether or not it's a lineup that we would actually play in the tournament, it does give a good example of something I would encourage listeners to at least think about, which is how can you put together a team that is probably at least not going to be heavily duplicated, and yet you do get to a lot of really good players, and you play a scenario where the team is internally consistent, coherent, what have you. This is a lot of fun. Ben, that's going to do it for our jump back in episode of Stealing Bananas, our first in the new year. We welcome everybody, or wish everyone a happy 2024. We hope that you off to a very good start, 11 days in at this point. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch. Make sure you are subscribed to Stealing Lines, to Stealing Signals, to Stealing Signals Gold. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Our code has changed to RV Radio 2024 with the new year. You can get 10% off of your sub there. We appreciate all the people who have left ratings and reviews. That's such a great sort of Christmas present, holiday present, what have you to us. It really helps us with the algorithm when you leave cool notes there. We really appreciate it. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.